Let's get going. Sounds like your work there is really going well, though, Gregory. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
You seem to really
Well,
have a burden.
this one in '96 has made a commitment to meet on Shabbat, um, and seem to be more resilient in their commitment. There's another one that's considerably out of the way. That's a little later. They usually have theirs at 3, so depending on which one I go to, I don't facilitate that one, but the one in '96 I facilitate.
You're a busy pastor.
Yeah, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more, though. I mean, I'd like to see a midweek uh, something, you know. Um,
Well, it does my heart really good to see that you're so involved with the people there, and that's really what we need.
yeah, it's a blessing. It's a blessing that I have people willing to let me come in and share and teach. Really, you know.
Do they buy you steaks and new cars?
Sometimes they send me home with food,
Oh, well, that's
you know.
good. Yeah.
Um, and I got a menorah one time. Um, the man, his name is. Let me show you this. This is quite a neat thing that he built himself. He's using Paleo Hebrew, mind you.
Wow.
Look at that. Yod Hey Vav Hey.
What are those letters made of? Copper pipe?
Copper piping.
Oh,
He's
very-
quite. He's also going to make a really big menorah and put it in his front yard.
there you go. No Santa there. Well, that would be a good topic. Is Christmas a Jewish holiday? Maybe we'll take that up the next time. What we're going to try to do today, with your help, is to make some inroads in trying to figure out who influenced whom. That is to say, did the Greeks and their philosophies influence the Jewish writers, especially the Hellenistic Jewish writers, down through primarily, we're talking about 7th century BC on through 1st century. So that's quite a long time span. Or on the other hand, was the Torah and Moses at the bottom of this whole thing that influenced Greeks who took off with it and added their own philosophies to it? I would like to start with a quote from a wonderful paper by Lepera, and we'll go on from there. With all this history behind philosophy, it's clear that man has continued to add his 2 cents worth to the point of denying the God who is behind the thought and the ability to think. Philosophy has been influenced by faith and in turn changed it and is now affecting faith. Unfortunately, the aspect of thought contributed by man and not from Elohim's word has established a Western system of thought relieved of any discipline and self-checking mechanisms. Professor Kelly Ross, Department of Philosophy, Los Angeles Valley College. In looking at the beginning of philosophy and its modern outcroppings, see a dangerous trend. He wrote this in the book, The Origin of Philosophy. Indeed, it is a distressing and sobering new truth of history, little suspected before our time, that a vast, educated class may, by its very nature, be hostile to freedom, democracy, and the creation of wealth for everyone. What we find today is that many academics deny there is truth, revel in the irrationality and incoherence of their own assertions, and nakedly assert that power is the end of all discourse. It should be no surprise to see the educated promoting ignorance and the free promoting tyranny, all in the hope that power will fall to them. And that is a very cogent assessment of where we're at today in the matter of philosophy and religion.
I
So,
would say politics too.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I've been reading some of Damian Mackey this week, who I discovered here, who writes on the subject of philosophy and especially the influence of Torah on Greek philosophy and vice versa. He puts forward that all these great philosophers, which I'll mention here in a minute, were greatly influenced originally by the Hebrew way, but leaving out the deity. That's the difference between philosophy and religion. Philosophy just has no deity. He says that the Greek philosophers may not have even existed, but might be just made over patriarchs, especially Moses, Joseph, Jacob, etc. And these Greek philosophers, as I mentioned, from 600 BC on, they lived in the time of the dispersion, and that the Torah certainly went out with the tribes, especially to the east. And to the east, of course, became in 300 AD a part of the Greek Empire, the empire of Alexander the Great, whose philosophy was to see that Greek culture was to be extended all over the world. And as long as you did what he said in regards to Greek philosophy and religion, he would leave you alone. But if you went back to your own way, then he would come in and make slaves of you. So Mackey's idea is that the Torah was actually redone as philosophy. We see, especially in the first century, the Hellenistic Jewish philosophers and religious people that are under the influence of Greek philosophy. I'm talking primarily about Philo Judea, Philo the Jew from Alexandria, one of the capitals of this gigantic Greek empire that Alexander brought forth from 300 BC and on. And another well-known person who seems to be greatly influenced by Greek philosophy is the Apostle Paul, whose writings are just utterly Platonic, which I'll describe what that means in a minute. And today, for us, we're bombarded by our colleagues who separate Greek from Hebrew customs and beliefs, but who seem not to have a good handle on the difference between the two. I see, like on Facebook, people write on there, that's Greek, or you're following the Greeks rather than the Hebrews, etc. But it seems to me now that I've been studying this week that the two have been mixed up to the point of being something completely different. As for those philosophers, let me name a few that were especially influential. The earliest was a man named Thales, going back to the 7th century BC. Thales is known as the first scientist, and he got into theories of origins. And at the time, there were really 5 different essences: air, fire, what are the other 2?
Wind, water.
Water. The 5th is ether. I'm missing one. However, Thales looked at origins from that perspective, and he said that it couldn't be the first 4. He said it had to be water. as the origin of all life and philosophy. And that is very prevalent today, especially when we think about evolutionary theory and our progenitors crawling out of the organic soup onto land and eventually becoming, well, us. So there's Thales. The next one coming along is very influential. It was a man named Heraclitus, also 7th, 6th century. Heraclitus, as far as we know, originated the idea of the logos, the word, as an intermediary between the creative forces, not a god, creative forces and humanity. Very much like we get the theology in the scripture of Logos and Sophia, that Logos and Sophia are intermediaries through which Elohim worked his creation. I say Sophia, that is wisdom, that is especially prevalent in the apocryphal section of the scriptures, where we see a very cogent, easily identifiable influence of Greek philosophy, especially Platonism, in books like The Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach and other ones. Now, what we're coming to here is Heraclitus has the idea of something like there is a son of man, this figure he called Logos, but unidentified. And the way he puts it is very much like we read, say, in the book of Enoch, that there is some type of soter, of a savior type that's in between, through which everything came to be that came to be. Now, that sounds pretty familiar to us if we read the Gospel of John, because he begins his prologue with in the beginning was the Logos, the Word, the Devar. But throughout the 7 centuries between Heraclitus and the New Testament, the figure of the Logos was never identified, because that Logos figure was only meant to be some type of natural system through which water came to create the beings that we are now. The breakthrough here was in John 1, where for the first time a philosopher identifies who that Logos is. Now that's a breakthrough, because John is using a very identifiable Greek concept, a philosophical concept, and I think he's using that purposely in order to appeal to the Hellenists that lived in his time. For the first time, identifying Logos as a person. Hold on just a second. That is a breakthrough. And I think especially when you read John in the original language, which I believe was Greek, to read what it says, it is an incredible parallel to Genesis chapter 1, and also to this very well-known Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who had come before John by 600-700 years. The next one that influenced us, or Torah influenced, was Socrates, talking about the 5th century. His method of education is still used today. It's a method that, well, it's called Socratic teaching, where the teacher questions the student and expects the student to answer difficult questions, and then corrects the student as they go through. So it's like the catechisms of the church, especially the mainstream churches, where you go to a class in order to join up, and you're presented with question after question after question, and you're expected to learn the correct answers to those questions based on whatever the philosophy or theology is of the particular church or cult that you're joining. Socrates is followed by Plato, probably the most influential of them all in the 5th century. Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Now, here's what Plato taught, because this is very prevalent today in the church, Platonism. He said that what we perceive as reality here, the solid things, the people, they are primarily illusions based on the perfect form of whatever the created being is, that perfect form being in another place, like a 4th dimension that we really couldn't access. But what we are seeing, feeling, experiencing is a greatly decayed image of the perfect thing that is in that other realm. It reminds me a lot of morphic resonance and morphic fields, very similar. Now, Plato was known as the father of Western philosophy, and of course, we get the word Platonic from him. The ideas that the Christian church has concerning the afterlife and heavenly things is very much based in Plato's reworking of perhaps the Hebrew scriptures, primarily the prophets. Now, Platonic thinking has greatly influenced the church fathers, obviously, because this theology has gone on and on, rather than the biblical theology of, say, the soul, the nephesh. We understand from a Greek point of view that a man is made up of 3 different parts: body, soul, and spirit. And all 3 of these parts are liberated from the other. That the soul is eternal apart from the body dies, the soul lives on, and the spirit goes back to the created demiurge, or whatever it is that they consider to be the thing that acted in creation. We have a great deal of this in the Christian theology of spiritualism, spiritual things. Paul seems steeped into this, and Plato has very much influenced our religion, and for another reason besides, because his student was a man named Aristotle. Now we're getting to the 4th century BC. Why Aristotle was extremely important is twofold. One, he was the teacher of Alexander the Great, the private tutor who taught Alexander the Great, whose father, Philip of Macedon, died when Alexander was young. And you know the story after that. As a very young man, Alexander set out to rule the entire world and to bring the ideas of Aristotle, his teacher, to everyone in the world. And we see even from Macedon or Greece, where he was from, we have all kinds of different cities and towns all over the world called Alexandria, and primarily the one in Egypt, which was a very big center for not only 1st century Jewish philosophy, but also Christian philosophy. It's said that Mark the evangelist ended up in Alexandria, and much of the schisms of the church were then tried in Alexandria. And by the time the church got very influential there through Greek and then Roman armies that you were forced to believe the way of Plato, or you would be eliminated or at least excommunicated. Aristotle's writings were lost. They were lost up until the Muslims came into Europe to conquer Europe, and they brought Arabic copies of Aristotle up, which were discovered by the church, and the church fathers, the later fathers, were so taken with Aristotle's ideas about the soul, the immortal soul, that the one called St. Thomas Aquinas actually used Aristotle to rethink the entire understanding of the Roman Catholic Church and therefore Christianity everywhere. He applied what he knew of the New Testament to the ideas of Aristotle on the soul, especially. One of Aristotle's most well-known dissertations is called De Anima. That means on the soul, where there is described, among other things, the threefold person again, the trinity of the person. So we are getting an idea that this formulation, especially coming from a Catholic divine who lived, I think, in the 15th century, maybe the 14th, who had the power over all Christian doctrine in the world, to remake it and remaking it in the newly found Aristotle translations. And so, of course, we get down to Alexander the Great. We don't know much about him personally, except I heard that he died choking on a piece of pork. I don't know if that's true or not, but Alexander brought Greek philosophy to the world and what we call Hellenistic culture. Remember, in the New Testament, there were people called Hellenists. These were primarily Jews who had abandoned the way of the Jew and taken up Greek philosophy and religion and Greek customs. We think when the disciples are engaging Hellenists, we're kind of thinking, well, these are just Jews that spoke a different language, but it was much more than that. These were bloodline Jews and Hebrews who, in the course of 300 or 400 years, had changed through their generations the religion they practiced, because the religion that they practiced was primarily illegal. So when we think of New Testament times, let's think that they've been under Alexander the Great, and then just before Yeshua came, under the Romans, who were Grecophiles, Hellenists themselves. And I would think that if the Chinese were here for 400 years and taken over this country, I suspect that most of us in religious practice would be Confucianists now. But there would be that remnant, that holdout of people that would fight to enjoy the old religions and their customs before these foreigners came. And that was really the way it was in the first century, that led, of course, to the revolts against Rome and the destruction of the entire Jewish Hebrew system at that time. So again, Damian Mackey talks about Torah redone as philosophy. And it's a very interesting paper. If anybody would like to take a look at some of my sources here, I have them for you. But now let me open to you, now that I've gone on 15 minutes. What are your thoughts concerning Greek versus Hebrew philosophy and religion? And please say something.
Jackson, I'll start. How's that?
That'd be great. I'm glad to see you here.
Well, I have to start by saying, well, shalom, Shabbat shalom. I couldn't agree with you. I could not disagree with you more, Jackson. 100% in your analysis. Well, let me put it this way. That's fine, but it is, in my opinion, is a 100% un-Hebraic viewpoint of the situation. So
Okay. Tell us about it.
because you know that I feel that, to Judah were given the oracles, which means the writings. And if you read their writings, and I happen to be an Israelite, so I'm going to be partial to my writings and my sages and the prophets that I would write. So, but it's very clear, onefold. Okay, so Yahweh is always telling them, look, if you don't, stick with me, keep the commandments, do Torah as I'm telling you, keep this thing on track, you will be the head and not the tail. And that is something that has always plagued Judah because that is their reality. Their intellectual property has been stolen and repackaged and given over to the Gentiles, just like everything else.
That's exactly what I'm saying, Liz.
So, but see, you're not explaining that it is the Hebrews who taught Aristotle and Socrates and Pythagoras and these people their philosophies.
That's my
Japheth is in the tents of Shem, not the other way around. I think if you read even just Josephus against Apion, he makes a really great case that, and you're a historian looking at his sources, and I could do quotes that like Pythagoras and Aristotle, these people learned directly from the sages of Israel. So
There is a historical reference for what Liz is talking about. If I could just jump in quickly before I have to go. And I agree with what Liz is saying. There is historical belief that when the Israelites came into Egypt and became slaves, that one of the tribes, members of the tribes of Dan, who were seafaring people, departed from Egypt before the Exodus. And John Hyrcanus and also John makes cryptic reference to this. John Hyrcanus, in one of the books of the Maccabees, salutes the Spartans as brothers.
Yeah.
And also, we find in the book of John, 2 John, that there is this historical reference, which most people would not know what he's referring to, but it says here, anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Messiah does not have Yahuwah. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. And there's a whole lot of teaching that goes into that, but Dan ran ahead. They became they lost their heritage. They never got a chance to be there at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. They have remnants of Abrahamic religious thought and their philosophy and so on. And so if you go all the way back to the Exodus or before the Exodus, when Dan reputedly departed, then that would explain a lot, and it would put things into context of that the Greeks learned from the Hebrews.
Let me say that this is not my opinion, Liz. I'm trying to learn something. That's why I invite you on here with a lofty invitation, because this is an opening. When I talked before in the last forum about this, I didn't know what I was talking about, to be quite honest with you, and I got convicted about that, and I started looking into it, and I found this Damian Mackey, who believes just exactly as you say, that the Torah was used by these philosophers, but redone and remade in their image. Now, I felt bad about polemicizing in that last time because, we really didn't have any source material or source documents. You didn't come up with any. I really couldn't either. So I wanted to go back and find out. And I found Mackey. I'm trying to gain an opinion here based on something that is a firm foundation. And
Okay,
I
well,
want
let
you
me,
to help me.
okay, I'll just give you 3 quotes from, one from Josephus, right, against Apollyon, one from Rabbi Abraham Yagel, who lived in, and this is all over, maybe Scott, you can back me up too. I have read this numerous times in many Mishnah accounts, many different texts that the Jews have where they say the same thing. But here's against Apollyon. I don't know what verses is, 15 maybe. But anyways, it's about Pythagoras. And his history was written by this guy, Hermippius. Does that ring a bell? One of his greatest, let's say, historians who wrote about him was Hermippius, and he's not a Jew, so he is a Greek. But he says this. He did say this. Hermippius said, in imitation of the doctrines of the Jews and Thracians, and the Thracians are Japheth. They're not Israelite or Semitic. They're Thracians, but they also have a very close history with Jewish thought, which he transferred into his own philosophy. For it is very truly affirmed of this Pythagoras that he took a great many of the laws of the Jews into his own philosophy. Nor was our nation unknown of old to several of the Grecian cities, and indeed was thought worthy of imitation by some of them. This is declared by Theophrastus in his writings concerning laws, for he says that the laws of the Tyrians, which is Thracians, forbid men to swear foreign oaths, among which he enumerates some others, and particularly that called Korban, which oath can only be found among the Jews, and declares what a devout man may call a thing devoted to God. So, like I said, I have read that, and not who was the great. That's Pythagoras. That's and I read that about Aristotle. About Socrates, and now this is from a rabbi, Abraham Yagel.
Before you go farther, you said that was an adversus.
That's against Apollyon.
Okay.
Okay, and Josephus just lays it all out. I mean, if you read that, it's a very short text, and he just, to my mind, makes a total case. Well, here's another one he says. I want to say, and see, a lot of this. Let me just give this quote again from that. He says, but what is the strongest argument of our exact management in this matter of what I am now going to say? And his whole thing is the superiority of the Jews. Like they made this stuff, and I don't mean made it up, but they are the originators of true theosophy and philosophy and theology of Yahweh Elohim, and the rest of the nations have. But he says, so he's making the case, right? Why would I say that? And he says that, but what is the strongest argument of our exact management in this matter is what I am now going to say, that we have the names of our high priests from father to son set down in our records for the interval of 2,000 years. And if any of these have been transgressors of these rules, they are prohibited to present themselves at the altar or to be partakers of any other of our purifications. And you can just think of Ezra. I mean, that's exactly what Ezra did at the time they came back. And this is justly, or rather necessarily done, because everyone is not permitted of his own accord to be a writer or a scribe, nor is there any disagreement in what is written, they being only prophets that have written the original and earliest accounts of things as they learned them of Yahweh himself by inspiration. And others have written what they have, what hath happened in their own times, and that in a very distinct matter. I mean, making the case too, and this is where you get into a lot of the concept of the oral Torah, because it's given, disciple to pupil, father to son. It's a very, and I like say these are the same people that gave us the Dead Sea from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Isaiah. That's like 99.9, the same thing we have today. And then my last point I'll just make, and then
What was the source of that one?
That's the same text. That's against Apollyon.
Appian. Okay.
Okay, how do you say it? Then this last one, Rabbi Abraham Yagel, who lived 1553, 1623. It says, this is obvious to anyone who has read what is written on the philosophy and principles of Democritus, and especially on Plato, the master of Aristotle, whose views are almost identical to those of the sages of Israel. and who on some issues almost seem to speak from the very lips and mouths of the sages and in their language, without any blemish on their lips. And why should we not hold these views, since they are ours, inherited from our ancestors by the Greeks? And down to this day, great sages hold that the views of Plato and great groups of students follow him, and is well known to anyone who has served the sage of the academy and entered in their studies that they are found from our land. So, I mean, to me, it's, and my last point on Philo, because this is from Philo's writings, he says the mind as the sight of the soul is an idea older than Aristotle, who mentions it as an existing saying in Topics 108.1.10. I guess that's referencing a text. But, you know, again, my last point on Philo, see, this is the thing, he's not a Hellenized Jew. He is just a Jew living in diaspora, in a totally Jewish enclave. I mean, to think that just because he lived in Alexandria, that makes him a Greek, that's like, I mean, you can't really say that. Those Jews lived in diaspora, lived totally tight. I mean, you can't make the case. He is as thoroughly Hebraic in his philosophy as any sage of Israel. So that's all my opinion.
On that, you'd be going against probably every scholar that ever wrote, but I tell you, both you and Greg came up with some excellent primary sources, which helps me a lot.
Who's the authority here? A scholar? Or this is my point. My last point. If anyone wanted to really read, I think the best case for this is to read the Targums. You can get them online, you know, the comparative where they have like all four of them,
yeah.
Jerusalem and read Genesis 49, I believe it is, or 39. I think it's when Jacob blesses the sons. And what he says, it's so much more fleshed out in the Targums. And it's so clear that this is going to be, it's their property. They're, you know, and basically, and how Judah has it. I mean, my point is, are we going to believe scholars, Jackson, or are we going to believe what our texts say? There's no difference between our texts say that Yeshua is the Mashiach. Well, you know, you can't pick and choose so much. Judah had her property stolen, and she has been the tail. And this is the point. And it's part of our job to restore it to them. And this is what's all going to, in my opinion, going to be coming out. But that's all.
Okay. Well, what I see is a huge divide between Torah, prophets, and what the Greeks taught, and especially about spiritual things. Just as you mentioned, Aristotle and De Anima, the soul, it flies in the face of a Hebrew understanding of that. And I know when we get to the New Testament times, it's pretty prevalent, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to investigate this a little more. Let's find some primary sources, and maybe we could make a definitive statement. And you both have helped out immensely.
Well, and that last point, just one more thing to say is, see, now this is my opinion. We know the Essenes and the Pharisees, the only ones who didn't believe in the immortality of the soul were the Sadducees. I mean, I don't understand. The Dead Sea Scrolls are all over the immortality of the soul. The Clementine homilies, I mean, they stated so clearly. I don't understand. I've never understood personally where you get that from, because it's a very clear, immortality is not the same thing as like eternity, but the point is the soul is made up of immortal. So, but, I mean, it's totally Hebraic. It's a scene, and it's
over and over again in the scripture. It talks about the soul that sins, it will die.
Yeah, but in the context, you know, the soul in its physicality will leave its physical body. So, I mean, it depends on how you, but the soul does not die. The soul goes on. It goes, there's places. The soul, I mean, that's the whole point of, oh my gosh.
I think the Hebrew idea is like, is that the body and the soul, or the being, are one. And that which can come in is the spirit. But I think probably we might need to check with Scott on that, because he's the authority, I think. What is the difference, Scott?
Okay, well, first, one scripture came up to mind. Of course, this is New Testament. It's Hebrews 4:12, and I believe in the Greek it says for the word. So it's not Torah, it's logos of Hashem is quick and powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing of the soul, the nephesh, and the ruach, and of joints and marrow. So he's talking about the flesh, and so there is a division there, but in the Olam Hazeh, in the present age, to function, you have to have a body. But Hashem is outside of time. So once the body dies, then there's the nephesh, which is who that person was. It continues to exist in the Olam Haba, outside of time. And then the Ruach is the actual life or spirit of Hashem that's within that soul, if they so chose to allow that to come into their soul. Because the soul can serve the body only, or it can serve both the body and the spirit. And you have to make that choice. That's basically a Hebraic understanding of it.
That's my understanding too. The spirit is something that a person has to make a choice about.
Yes.
Go
You
on.
can live totally to serve the flesh in this present age, or you can serve the eternal God and serve the spirit. You still have to serve your body somewhat. You have to eat, you have to drink, but you have to control that. So that's where the Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hatov comes in. That's the free will choice of choosing one or the other.
Well, Scott, let me ask you too, because I've done, even in the soul, Hebraically, there are 5. They will say 5 levels of the soul. And, so our nephesh, I think that's what confuses, is just the animated part of us, like our animal soul, the part that.
Right. We have an animal soul.
We have an animal soul, and that's what a nephesh is. And that's what we, so if we're hungry, we got to go eat. That's the body. That's the part of the soul that's going to respond to the bodily needs. Sure. But the Ruach is given to us for our spiritual rise. So if we do want to ascend or, return to our Creator, we would have to use, our Ruach could bring us up. But the Neshama is the part of the soul, and then there's 2 other higher parts. But, it's a pretty developed, and it's in the Hebrew word. So you can't, it's not like it's made up, because it's totally, all these words have different Hebrew words to them.
Right. Well, in the Kabbalah, they go in and decide deeper. And Kabbalah just means the receiving. You have Kabbalat Shabbat, the receiving of the Sabbath. So yes, it is there, but you have to remember that in Kabbalah, which you're deriving the more divisions of the nephesh or the soul, that's not all to be seen as totally literal. It's just for maybe a deeper spiritual understanding of those divisions or parts of the soul. Like you said, there's obvious division between the animal nephesh and then the nephesh of the soul of who you are as a man. You have the opportunity to go on beyond the animal soul if your free will so chooses that. And then there's different levels of kedusha or sanctification, or levels of understanding. And we all go up and down through our life through these different levels of our nephesh. Sometimes we only serve our body. Sometimes we start on the spiritual. Sometimes we are highly sanctified. But we can't remain in that state in this present age, in a highly sanctified state, unless you're the Messiah, maybe.
Is there a reference for that? I would really like to investigate that. Yeah, where is it in the Targums or?
Well, the Targums, you have your Targum Onkelos, your Targum Ben Uziel. So those are Aramaic paraphrases of the scripture, or Greek paraphrases. And what they do, the Targums couldn't be read word for word in a synagogue. You always read the Hebrew. But you could, if you were in Israel, somebody could read the Targum and then explain it to those Greek Jews or non-Jews in the synagogue, what the Hebrew stated, having read the Targum. So it's giving you a common understanding in a somewhat approved translation of the language. In other words, to translate it properly from the Hebrew to the Greek or to the Aramaic. So the Targumim are helpful. In other words, I'll give you an example just from Genesis 1:2. It says this, the Ruach of God in our English translation says hovered over the face of the waters. But the Targum says the spirit of Mashiach. So in other words, the Targum is giving you an understanding that was accepted as a good translation. Does that make sense to you?
There are some comments here on this last discourse from Jeremy Leduc and Daoud Yazakael. A little side discussion here. Jeremy says, the soul is not immortal. Daoud says, I agree. On Judgment Day, a lot of souls will be destroyed. And Jeremy replies, just empty words since no one defines the word soul. The soul is not without a body. That's what I have always understood right there. Now, you say that, you're still saying that the soul is an immortal part of a human being. And that's what Aristotle wrote about. But then again, where did he get it?
Well,
go ahead, Liz.
well, first of all, who is that? Let's see, Jeremy or
Jeremy.
I'm going to get in trouble. Dodd, how do you say your name? I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm so sorry.
Daoud.
My name is Daoud Yahatsakal.
Daoud. I'm sorry. Okay,
Daoud.
I would ask a question though, but if the soul is not immortal, but yet it's destroyed on Judgment Day, I mean, there could be a lot of space. Let's say you live before the flood or something. There's a lot of time between that and let's just say Judgment Day. If it's not immortal, where's it been all that time?
You're dead.
That we can read in the book of Enoch. If you read the book of Enoch, you read it all the souls. There are 4 kind of different places where each nephesh will be stored, so that the people who are righteous are not in the same place where the people who are unjust.
Right. Yeah. That's Abraham's bosom kind of thing.
And you also have the place where the holy ones are kept, and the place where I thought the set apart ones are kept apart. So there are different kinds of levels in the way how you live and the way how you obey the commandments of the Most High Yah. And according to your works, you will be set in a different kind of place. So that not the people who, for example, the Christians will not be on the same spot where the Messianics are. That's what I think.
Do you think they'll build churches in the third heaven?
I have no clue about that. I don't think a building will be a place where we will join together with Messiah.
I was reading in a Presbyterian theology that when they ask, well, what happens when somebody dies? And so they go to the third heaven, but it's like in Luke where there is a lake or a river of fire going through this place. And on one side, Jesus is there on the heaven side, and on the other side is the hell side. And that's where there's all lawlessness, and they're roiling around there waiting to be resurrected. But it shocked me to read such a thing as that, because it is so speculative and it's so anthropomorphic. It's so human. It's almost like it's mythology there. And I know that's in both First Enoch and Second Enoch, but I don't know if I could even understand that.
Yeah, if we take, for example, the what you call it again? Pardon my English, because I'm not from England or the United States, so I have to think twice before I say something, just to make that up. Thank you. Well, what I also wanted to say is that in the in the writings of Clementine, homilies and recognitions, and in other writings, you can read that the soul of humankind, which which is not just and righteous, will be completely destroyed, will be vanished from existence. So that's what I think.
I believe that the scriptures evolved over time. You know, they were written between, well, maybe 7th, 8th century BC and 1st century. Don't you see an evolution there of those concepts of evil and of afterlife? Certainly at the first book, they say the earliest book is Job. There is a huge difference between what Job says concerning these things of the afterlife and what, say, Paul says, or between what the devil is in Job and then 800 years later what Paul says the devil is. There's a evolution there. And if you look at wisdom, Sophia, there's a gigantic evolution, especially during the time between 400 BC and 1st century, that time when the Greek Jews were writing the Apocrypha. It's almost an explosion in those 400 years, and to me, pretty much a synthesis of the two. Because, you know, you've got the Jews writing in Greek by that time because they had to, and they were, it was messed up together. It was synthesized together, it seems to me. Are you a reader of the Apocrypha? Especially, say, the Wisdom of Solomon. They've got the 7 cardinal virtues there that are well known from Greek philosophy, and many other things in there that hail right back to some of these guys. Now, I can understand when McGee tells us that they started out with the Torah, but as time went on, they evolved and began to put their own stuff in there and take Elohim out of there because Elohim did not fit their theology. Oh, here's Andrew Hoy comes on. There are 4 words in the King James that turn these spirit, soul, mind, body ideas into a yard sale. Huh. Confusion about that. And the relationship are translated in English in very problematic ways. And I have seen in the translation of Enoch a number of times that the translators have translated what should be spirit as soul.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that, surely.
Oh, yeah.
And the translators are during this time into English, they're just all over the place. They're translating through the glasses of their philosophies, it seems.
So I would postulate that that is what a lot of the problem is that we are not Hebrew speakers. We don't have, it's not our primary language, so we can't read these texts and see it in the original because my understanding, these words are very specific.
Yeah.
And if you cannot be, like you said, if you're putting soul for spirit, and see, like, and translators are very confused. If they don't have this worldview, if they don't have this understanding, it's not going to get passed down correctly. But as I said, like Apaya Josephus was saying, there is this unbroken tradition. This is why it's important to, like I said, by faith, you'd have to, that the Jews did have a system of passing down accurate oral transmission. This gets into of what the true meanings of these. If you have the kind of Yeshua teaching the disciples, the quote unquote, like the keys to the kingdom, the understanding of these things, he would teach the masses in a parabolic way, a drash way, but he would explain the deeper understanding. So where did Yeshua get it from? It had to have existed as a knowledge stream among some sects in Israel, or he wouldn't have, I doubt he just made it up, obviously, right? So this is where people don't want to believe that the Kabbalah is an authentic received tradition.
Right.
Then they'll never figure it out. You're going to be just at the whims of these translators who don't know what they're talking about. You're going to read English translations that are mixing up soul and spirit. You're never going to see it in the Hebrew, or you're never going to believe that these words in here are very specific. And that's not even giving them their cantillation marks. That's not even taking account of vowel points that are in their context. So it's no wonder to me that it's all over the place. But
well, in one sense, think about it. Yeshua wasn't a Sopharim or a Sofer, a scribe. So everything he said is oral Torah. I mean, in one sense, that's true.
Yeah, he was, and he restored it. I mean, that's where these guys got back on track in a lot of ways. I mean, if you want to go to the early church, the Nazarene, they were not confused. And Paul, again, he's not a Greek. He is just an extremely deep thinking Hebraic Torah sage who understands these at all levels, and he writes a lot on the Sod level.
Yeah, and he is familiar with the Hellenistic ways. It's pretty obvious. So he's using the combination to reach Hellenists from their viewpoint and trying to give them some of the Hebraic understanding simultaneously.
Yeah, and why not?
From their viewpoint, how they've been trained in order to reach them so they can understand. And of course, some of the Greek philosophies, there's some truth there. So he can take, he's so wise of a sage, he can take the Hellenistic things and then readapt them back to some Hebraic understandings in order so that they can comprehend.
And what's wrong with that? I mean, seriously,
Nothing.
if you want to reach people, you have to start with what they can relate to and then build on it. We're Ephraimites. We're starting where we are. And, precept by precept, it's not an easy job.
Well, it's pretty easy. The two worst translated books of what people call the New Testament are Galatians and Hebrews. And, Hebrews in the English, even if you just go back to if you go to the Greek, you'll look that the verb tenses are almost all changed.
Yeah.
And so you'll find out, it'll say, oh, there was a figure then standing, but the Greek will say is. And so what happened in the translation is whoever did the translations, they had a preconceived concept, and so they translate their own concept into their translation when it really isn't there. And then the idea of, in Hebrew, one of the most important concepts to understand from the get-go for any translation is you have to understand the term olam.
Yeah.
So it can be translated as forever, but forever ends at the end of the olam hazeh. The olam haba is the timeless. And so when a person departs the olam hazeh, then they have to go before a judgment, before Hashem, to live again. So in other words, forever really does end, but it's outside of the context of time that we have. So let's say Adam, we know he died maybe 6,000 years ago. Okay, so he's dead, but he enters the olam haba. But he died, in the Hebrew concept, he died on Tuesday and today is Friday. So in other words, he hasn't been twiddling his thumbs going, oh my gosh, 6,000 years have gone by. When's the judgment going to finally come? Because he's outside of our realm of time.
Yeah.
And that's what the book of Hebrews, if you don't understand those concepts of olam haba and olam hazeh, you won't even be able to interpret the book properly. Plus, the verb changes, just ruin the book. They ruin it.
Most of the New Testament is written in what's called a historic present tense.
Mm-hmm.
It is written in present tense for the purpose of putting you in the present.
Which is okay.
Yeah. It should be. In fact, it's much more exciting when you actually retranslate it and put it in the right tense, for sure. It's not all was, not in the aorist, but it's all happening now.
Right.
Mark says over and over again, immediately.
So it happened then. It's historical. It's happening now, and it will happen again.
And it's a cycle. It's
Yeah.
all
Oh,
a cycle
sure.
system. But let me make a point too with Greek. Why I don't think in Jackson, I'm sorry, again, I'm not a Greek supremacist. I definitely think Hebrew, even in Greek, you only have two words. Why Galatians is so hard to understand. There's only one word for law in Greek. No, so what, it's all law. But yet in Hebrew, you're going to have tons of different words to help you get the nuances
Sure.
of what kind of law you're talking about. And that's like huge. That's why we are where we are.
Well, you started off the conversation. Let me bring in Devarim, or Deuteronomy 4, and this will tie into everything. It's chapter 4, verse 5. Behold, I have taught you statutes, judgments, commands, that you should do so in the land where you go and possess it. Keep therefore and do them. This is your hakmah, your wisdom, and your binah, your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear of all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So, that's back to where Jackson started, where, the other nations will hear of these, but they may not ascribe them to the God later on.
Yeah, it's like Glenn Beck says, you stole from me, you've stolen twice.
And then back to the concept of the nephesh, you can turn to Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah chapter 1. And before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you came forth from the womb, I'd already sanctified you. I ordained you as a nevah, a prophet, to the nation. Very interesting. But yet he was a prophet to Israel as well.
I have one more question here for Liz about the primacy of Judah. Do you consider that? No, I'm not being hostile. I just want to know. Do you consider that the message of Judah is unchanged down through the centuries and millennium? Is it the same message from the beginning?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. But see, what I think that is the way I see things now. See, and it says in the text there will always be a remnant. Unfortunately, we're listening. People like a lot of times read, and that's why I hate to use the word initiated. It makes people sometimes their skin crawl. But what it really means is there's always been a remnant in Israel, like it says, that have always kept the storyline straight and been able to transmit it accurately. That's what the text says that Yahweh would be able to do. Listen, maybe 90% of the people in the same thing with Christianity. I mean, what would you want to say? 70% of the people are just Sunday Christians and don't really you really wouldn't want them to teach because they couldn't do it well. It's the same in Israel. So,
sure.
Well, they're good people, and but the point is the knowledge base, the hook, like you said, it's got the hokmah and bina, the wisdom that Israel has. That's from the top. Hokmah and bina are great words to study out. Wisdom and understanding. That's in a category all of its own. That's not even the tradition. Like when Yeshua would be talking to the Pharisees, said, "Well, you've usurped with your traditions of men." The hokmah and bina has always been kept level of understanding with the Jews. That's what I believe. And if that isn't true, then how are we going to have a restoration of all things if there's not a base for the elect in the last days to find and figure it out again? And both sides, Judah and Ephraim, are going to be able to do this.
Now that you explain it that way, that makes perfect sense. You're saying that yes, there has been an evolution of thought, but there's a remnant who have kept the precepts, and it's out there to find if you'll go looking for it.
It's in the Kabbalah. I'm telling you, that's where it is.
You said that K word again, Liz.
I did. I'm sorry, but I'm,
I have to give you 3 demerits.
Sorry.
Anybody else hasn't chimed in before we close up? 3, 2, 1. All right. we have Andy Hoy on here today. He's the progenitor of the Bezalel Project. Undoubtedly, you've heard of that. It is the theory that the tabernacle was not rectangular, but it was round. And his theory just doesn't have any holes in it. I'm trying to get him to come on next week and explain it and do some screen sharing so you can see his models and so forth. He hasn't given me an answer yet. He's here trying us out. Okay? So if we can convince him to come, that's what we'll do next week. Otherwise, this might be a good topic to stay on, but I'll let you know. All right? And I thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful forum, and I enjoy it so much. And I enjoy you, and I love you, and we give you greetings and shalom this Shabbat until we meet again.